Sometimes the smallest choice decides who notices you. The rain had already soaked through Emily Carter's jacket by the time she turned onto 8th Street, her sneakers splashing through shallow puddles as she clutched a paper bag of cold takeout, calculating in her head how long $12 had to last when rent was already 5 days late and her daughter's fever hadn't broken since morning. The streetlights flickered above her, casting everything in a tired yellow glow, and for a moment she thought she imagined it, a dark leather wallet lying near the curb, just inches from the rear tire of a black SUV idling quietly like it didn't belong to this part of the city. She slowed, her breath catching slightly as she glanced around, no one nearby, no one watching, just the hum of distant traffic and the quiet weight of opportunity sitting on wet asphalt. Emily crouched, fingers brushing the slick surface before she picked it up, heavier than expected, the kind of weight that didn't come from leather alone. Inside, crisp bills lined perfectly. More money than she'd seen in one place in months, maybe longer, enough to fix everything for a little while, enough to stop the constant pressure in her chest that never really went away. Her thumb paused over the edge of the cash, just for a second, just long enough for the thought to exist. No one would know, no one would miss it, people like this probably didn't even notice when money disappeared. But then she exhaled slowly, steadying herself, and flipped past the bills to the cards, her eyes landing on a name stamped in sharp, clean lettering that somehow felt heavier than the money itself, Adrian Volkov. Something about it made her stomach tighten, not fear exactly, but awareness, like she had just stepped into something larger than she understood. The SUV's engine purred softly, still running, still waiting, and Emily glanced up again, her pulse quickening, wondering if she should leave it, walk away, pretend she never saw it, but her fingers closed around the wallet instead. Firm now, decision made, she stood, rain dripping from her hair as she moved toward the nearest building entrance, a doorman barely glancing at her as she handed it over with a quiet explanation, her voice steady even though her hands weren't, and just like that, it was out of her life. She stepped back into the rain, the cold biting a little sharper now, the paper bag growing damp in her grip, and as she walked away, she didn't look back, didn't see the slight shift behind the tinted windows of the SUV, didn't notice the silhouette inside lean forward just enough to watch her disappear down the block, memorizing the way she walked, the way she didn't hesitate, the way she left everything behind without taking a single dollar. Emily did not realize she was being watched, not when she pushed open the door to her building with her shoulder, not when she climbed the narrow staircase that always smelled faintly of detergent and old paint, and not when she finally stepped into her small apartment where the air felt warmer, softer, like a place that held together simply because she needed it to. Her daughter Lily was curled up on the couch under a thin blanket, cheeks flushed, a quiet cartoon still playing on the television even though she had fallen asleep hours ago, and Emily set the damp paper bag down carefully before crossing the room, brushing a hand gently across Lily's forehead, the heat still there, still stubborn, making her chest tighten just a little more. "I am here," she whispered softly, more for herself than for the child, as she moved around the apartment in practiced motions, reheating the food, checking the thermometer, counting pills left in a nearly empty bottle. Every small action measured against the reality that she was always just one step behind what she needed. Outside, the rain continued, tapping against the window in uneven rhythms, and somewhere far below, tires moved through water, engines passing, life continuing without pause. By the time midnight settled fully over the city, Emily had finally closed her eyes on the edge of the couch, her hand resting lightly against Lily's shoulder, exhaustion pulling her under in pieces rather than all at once. Across town, in a space that felt nothing like her world, the wallet sat open on a polished surface, every bill untouched, every card in place, and the man who owned it stood perfectly still, his attention fixed not on what was missing, but on what had not been taken. Adrian Volkov did not ask questions twice, but this time, he did not need to, because the answer was already in front of him. Replaying on a silent screen, a grainy image of a woman in worn sneakers bending down in the rain, pausing just long enough to consider something most people would not have walked away from, and then standing up again without looking back. The room around him remained quiet, the kind of quiet that came from people who knew better than to interrupt, but Adrian did not acknowledge them, his focus narrowing on details that most would overlook. The way she held the wallet carefully, not greedily. The way she moved quickly, not nervously, and most of all, the way she disappeared without leaving anything behind that would make her easy to find. run it again, he said finally, his voice low, controlled, and the footage obeyed, looping once more as if the answer might change if he looked long enough. It did not, and that was exactly what unsettled him, not because he did not understand people, but because he did, and people like her did not fit into the patterns he had learned to expect. He reached forward, pausing the screen at the exact moment her face tilted slightly toward the light, just enough to catch a glimpse, not clear, not perfect, but enough. Find her, he said, not louder, not sharper, just certain, and this time there was no hesitation from anyone in the room because they all understood what that meant. Back in the small apartment, Emily stirred slightly in her sleep as the wind pressed softly against the glass, unaware that somewhere in the city, her decision had already begun to move through a world she had never seen, setting something into motion that would not simply pass her by like everything else had, something that had already chosen not to forget her. The next morning arrived too quickly, the kind of gray light that slipped through thin curtains without asking permission, and Emily was already awake before her alarm, her body trained by routine and worry more than rest, her hand instinctively reaching for Lily's forehead the moment she opened her eyes. The fever had dropped, just slightly, enough to ease the tightness in her chest but not enough to relax, not yet, and she let out a slow breath she had been holding since the night before. Whispering something soft that Lily did not fully hear but seemed to understand anyway, the apartment felt quieter now, the rain gone, replaced by the distant hum of early traffic and the faint clatter of someone in the building starting their day too soon, and Emily moved carefully, not to wake her daughter, measuring coffee grounds, checking her phone for the time, calculating minutes like they were currency she could not afford to waste. She had a shift in less than an hour, and calling out was not an option, it never was. So she left a glass of water within reach, a note on the small table beside Lily that read she would be back before lunch, and a promise she hoped she could keep. Outside, the air carried that damp chill that lingered after a storm, and Emily pulled her jacket tighter as she stepped onto the sidewalk, her mind already racing ahead to bills, to schedules, to the endless balancing act that defined her life. She did not notice the black sedan parked across the street at first, not because it was hidden, but because it did not belong to her world, and things that did not belong often went unseen until they chose otherwise. Across town, information moved faster than traffic, faster than reason, pulled together piece by piece from cameras, from records, from small details that connected more easily than most people realized, and within hours, a name had replaced the unknown figure on the screen, a location had replaced the blur of a street corner, and a life had taken shape in quiet reports that landed in front of Adrian without unnecessary explanation. He read through them once, then again, not because he needed to, but because something about the simplicity of it did not match the weight it carried. Single mother, part-time work, overdue rent, no criminal record, no hidden accounts, nothing that suggested calculation or strategy, just a pattern of surviving, one day at a time. His gaze paused on a small detail that most would have skipped, a medical note tied to Lily's recent clinic visit, a fever, untreated longer than recommended, and for a fraction of a second, something shifted behind his otherwise steady expression, not emotion, not quite, but recognition of a kind he did not often allow himself to acknowledge. She kept the money in her hand, one of his men said carefully, standing at a distance that respected both space and hierarchy, long enough to take it, if she wanted to, and Adrian did not look up immediately, his fingers resting lightly on the edge of the file as if the answer was somewhere between the lines rather than on them. But she did not. He replied finally, his voice calm, almost thoughtful, and that was the part that mattered, not the money, not the wallet, but the absence of choice when every reason pointed the other way. Back on the street, Emily adjusted her bag on her shoulder, her pace quickening as she checked the time again, unaware that the distance between her world and his was already closing, not with noise or force, but with intention, quiet and precise, the kind that did not ask whether it should, only when it would. And somewhere behind tinted glass, the engine of the sedan started softly, not following too close, not yet, just enough to ensure that this time, she would not disappear into the city without being found. By noon the city had warmed just enough to soften the edges of the morning, but Emily still felt the weight of time pressing against her ribs as she moved quickly behind the counter, her hands working on autopilot while her mind stayed somewhere else entirely, counting hours until she could get back home, wondering if Lily had woken up, if the fever had returned, if the note she left was enough to make her daughter feel less alone. The diner buzzed with its usual rhythm, orders called out. Plates sliding across the counter, the low hum of conversations blending into something steady and predictable, and for a moment, Emily leaned into that predictability, letting it carry her through another shift the way it always did. "You are distracted today," her coworker muttered under his breath as he passed her a tray, and Emily forced a small smile, nodding without explaining because explanations took time and energy she did not have to spare. Outside, sunlight reflected faintly off windshields, off glass, off surfaces that did not belong to her world, and across the street, the same black sedan remained, parked in a position that looked casual enough to ignore but deliberate enough to matter, its windows dark, its presence quiet, waiting without urgency. Inside that silence, observation continued, measured and patient, not invasive, not rushed, just certain. Emily stepped outside during her short break. The air carrying a faint trace of coffee and passing traffic, and she closed her eyes for a second longer than she meant to, letting the warmth hit her face as if it could replace the sleep she had not gotten, her fingers tightening slightly around the paper cup she held as she exhaled slowly, grounding herself in a moment that was not about bills or time or worry. She did not see the man across the street step out of the car, did not notice the way he adjusted his jacket with quiet precision. His gaze already fixed on her before he moved, not approaching yet, not interrupting, just watching the way she stood, the way she carried exhaustion without letting it break her posture. Adrian did not rush decisions, and this was not an exception, even if something about it felt different, not urgent, but inevitable. Back inside, Emily returned to her shift, unaware that the distance between observation and action had narrowed, that what had begun as curiosity was shifting into something more defined, more intentional. When her shift finally ended, the sun had already started to lower, stretching shadows longer across the sidewalk, and Emily moved quickly again, retracing the same path she had taken that morning, her thoughts already ahead of her steps, already at home, already with Lily. The black sedan pulled away this time, not following too closely, not drawing attention, just adjusting its position in a way that kept her within reach without making her aware of it. And inside, Adrian watched the reflection of her figure in the side mirror as it faded behind them, his expression unchanged but his decision no longer unformed. "Tonight," he said quietly, not as a question, not as a plan that needed discussion, but as a conclusion that had already been made, and no one in the car responded because they understood that some decisions did not require explanation, only execution. Back at the apartment, Emily pushed open the door with a small breath of relief, her eyes immediately finding Lily sitting up this time, wrapped in the same blanket but smiling faintly, the fever finally breaking just enough to let warmth replace worry, and Emily crossed the room quickly, kneeling in front of her, brushing hair away from her daughter's face with a gentleness that held everything she did not say out loud. Outside, evening settled in, the light fading, the air cooling again, and somewhere not far away, a black car slowed quietly to a stop, its engine humming softly as if it had been waiting for this exact moment to arrive. The knock came just after the city settled into that quiet space between evening and night, not loud, not urgent, but deliberate, the kind of sound that did not belong to neighbors or delivery drivers or anything familiar, and Emily froze for a fraction of a second where she stood in the small kitchen, her hand still wrapped around a glass of water she had been bringing to Lily. The apartment felt smaller suddenly, the air shifting in a way she could not explain, and she glanced toward the door, as if it might answer the question forming in her mind before she could ask it. Lily looked up from the couch, her voice softer now that the fever had eased. "Are you going to get it?" And Emily forced a calm she did not fully feel, setting the glass down before moving toward the door step by step, her heartbeat steady but louder than usual, echoing in the quiet. Another knock followed, the same rhythm, patient, certain, not asking, just waiting. She reached the door and paused, her hand hovering over the handle as she leaned slightly to look through the small peephole, and what she saw did not make immediate sense. A man standing there, tall, still, dressed in a way that did not belong in her building, his presence alone enough to shift the space around him even through a distorted lens. Emily opened the door slowly, not wide, just enough to see clearly, and the man on the other side did not move, did not speak right away, his eyes taking in the narrow hallway behind her, the worn edges of the frame, the quiet details that told a story without words. Up close, there was nothing accidental about him, every line precise, every movement controlled, and when his gaze finally settled on her, it did not carry surprise, only recognition. "Emily Carter," he said, not as a question, but as confirmation, his voice low, even. And she felt something tighten in her chest at the sound of her name spoken by someone she had never met. She did not answer immediately, not because she could not, but because she was trying to understand how this moment existed at all, how it connected to anything she had done. His hand moved then, smooth, unhurried, reaching into his coat before pulling out something familiar, the same wallet she had handed off and forgotten, now back in his possession like it had never left. "You found this," he continued, holding it lightly as if its weight was insignificant. Though his attention remained entirely on her, Emily nodded once, her voice quiet when it came. "I returned it," and the simplicity of the statement seemed to hold more weight than she intended. For a second, nothing else happened, the hallway silent, the distance between them unchanged, and then he took a step forward, not crossing the threshold, but close enough that the space between them felt smaller, more defined. "You had every reason not to," he said, his tone not accusatory, not impressed, just certain, like he had already considered every possibility and dismissed them all. Except one. Emily held his gaze now, unsure what answer he expected, unsure if there was an answer at all, because the truth felt too simple for the question. Behind her, Lily shifted slightly, the faint sound grounding the moment back into something real, something she understood, and Emily instinctively moved just enough to block the view inside, not aggressively, just protectively. The man noticed, of course he did, his eyes flicking past her for a fraction of a second before returning, and something in his expression changed, subtle, almost imperceptible, but there. "Good," he said quietly, closing the wallet and lowering it to his side, "because now I need to understand why someone like you walks away from something everyone else would take." And the way he said it made it clear that this was not a conversation that would end at the doorway, not a moment that would simply pass, but the beginning of something Emily had not chosen and could not yet see the shape of. Emily did not move right away, not because she felt threatened, but because the moment itself felt too precise to interrupt, like stepping too quickly would break something she did not yet understand, and the man in front of her seemed to notice that hesitation without reacting to it, his posture unchanged, his attention steady in a way that made everything else in the hallway feel distant. "There is nothing to understand," she said finally, her voice calm but quieter than she intended. "It was not mine," and the answer sounded almost too simple once it was spoken out loud, like it should not carry the weight it clearly did. Adrian watched her for a second longer, not searching for deception, but for something else entirely, something deeper than the words themselves, and when he spoke again, his tone shifted slightly, less analytical, more deliberate. "That is not how most people decide," he said, and there was no judgment in it, only fact, as if he had seen enough outcomes to know exactly how different this one was. Emily held the edge of the door a little tighter, grounding herself in something physical, something real, because the conversation had already moved beyond what felt normal, beyond what made sense in her world, and yet she did not step back, did not close the door, did not end it, even though part of her knew she could. Behind her, Lily's small voice broke the stillness again. "Mom," and Emily turned slightly, just enough to answer without taking her eyes completely off the man in front of her. "I am right here," she said softly, and when she faced him again, something had shifted in her posture, not fear, not defiance, but clarity, the kind that came from knowing exactly what mattered and what did not. Adrian noticed it immediately, the way her focus adjusted, the way her priorities arranged themselves without hesitation, and for the first time since he arrived, his gaze moved past her more intentionally, not intruding, just acknowledging, the faint outline of a small living room, a child sitting quietly, the details of a life that existed entirely outside of his own. He stepped back then, just a fraction, enough to remove the pressure of proximity without leaving, and reached into his coat once more, this time pulling out a small card, placing it carefully against the edge of the doorframe instead of handing it directly to her, as if understanding that the space between them needed to remain hers. "If you ever need anything," he said, the words measured, not casual, not exaggerated, "you use that number," and the way he said it carried more certainty than the offer itself, like it was not a suggestion but a condition already in place. Emily glanced at the card but did not pick it up immediately, her expression unreadable for a moment before she looked back at him. "I did not do it for anything," she said, and this time her voice did not waver at all, because that part was true in a way she did not need to explain. Adrian nodded once, a small, controlled motion that acknowledged the statement without challenging it, and for a brief second, the distance between their worlds felt less like a barrier and more like a contrast. Something that existed but did not cancel the other out. I know, he replied, and that was the part that changed everything, not because of what he offered, but because he understood without needing to be convinced, and as he turned to leave, his steps quiet against the worn hallway floor, the space he left behind did not return to what it had been before, because now there was something else in it, something unseen but present, something that did not ask permission to exist. Emily closed the door slowly, the soft click echoing louder than expected, and for a moment she stood there, her hand still resting against the wood, her eyes on the card he had left behind, knowing without knowing why that whatever had just begun was not going to end with a simple conversation at her door. Emily did not pick up the card right away, even after the hallway fell quiet again, even after the sound of his footsteps faded into something distant and untraceable, because some part of her understood that touching it meant acknowledging something she had not asked for, something that did not belong to the careful boundaries she had built around her life. Lily's small voice pulled her back before that thought could settle too deeply, and Emily turned, crossing the room in a few quick steps. Kneeling beside her daughter and brushing a hand gently through her hair, checking again for warmth, for signs that the fever might return, for anything that would anchor her back into what she knew, who was at the door. Lily asked softly, her eyes curious but still heavy with lingering exhaustion, and Emily hesitated just long enough to notice it before answering. Just someone who needed something back, she said, keeping it simple, because anything more complicated would not fit into this space. Into this life that ran on clarity and necessity. Lily nodded as if that explanation was enough, because for her, it was, and Emily let out a quiet breath she had not realized she was holding, standing up and moving toward the small kitchen again, the routine grounding her even as her thoughts drifted back to the doorway, to the way he had said her name like it already belonged to him, to the way he had understood something about her without asking. The card still rested against the doorframe, where he had left it, untouched, waiting in a way that felt intentional rather than accidental, and Emily glanced at it once, then again, her mind already forming reasons to ignore it, to leave it there until morning, to treat it like something temporary that would disappear if she did not engage with it. Outside, the city moved on without pause, cars passing, lights shifting, the rhythm of everything continuing as it always did. But inside the apartment, something had changed, not loudly, not dramatically, just enough to be felt in the spaces between actions. Hours passed quietly, the kind of quiet that came from exhaustion rather than peace, and by the time Lily had fallen asleep again, Emily found herself standing near the door without remembering when she had moved there, her eyes settling once more on the card, the clean edges, the single number printed in a way that suggested it was not meant to be shared often. She reached out this time, her fingers brushing the surface before picking it up, the motion small but decisive, and for a moment she just held it, feeling the weight of something she could not quite name. Across the city, Adrian stood near a window that overlooked streets far removed from hers, the lights below forming patterns that shifted constantly, and though the room behind him remained active, filled with quiet movement and low voices, his attention stayed fixed on something that was no longer in front of him, something that existed instead in memory. In the details he had chosen not to ignore, she did not call, someone said carefully from behind him, not questioning, just observing, and Adrian did not turn, did not respond immediately, because the absence of action was not the same as inaction. Not in this case. She will not, he replied after a moment. His tone steady, certain in a way that made further discussion unnecessary, and yet his gaze did not leave the city below, because certainty did not remove interest, it only defined it. Back in the apartment, Emily placed the card on the small table beside the couch, not hidden, not displayed, just present, and as she turned off the last light, the faint glow from the street outside caught the edge of it for a brief second before fading into shadow, leaving behind the quiet understanding that whatever this was, it had not ended, it had only changed shape. Morning came softer this time, the light slipping in gently through the thin curtains as if careful not to disturb what little rest the apartment had managed to hold on to, and Emily opened her eyes slowly, the weight in her chest lighter than the day before but not gone, never fully gone. Her first instinct was the same as always, reaching for Lily, checking her temperature with a quiet focus that overrode everything else. And when she found only warmth instead of heat, she let out a breath. That felt deeper than sleep had given her. Lily stirred, blinking up at her with a small smile that made everything else pause for just a second, long enough for Emily to believe that maybe today would be easier. Do you have to go to work? Lily asked, her voice still soft but steadier now, and Emily hesitated just long enough for the question to settle between them before nodding gently. Just for a little while, she said, brushing a strand of hair back. I will be back before dinner, and this time she intended to keep that promise. The apartment moved slowly into motion after that, the quiet rhythm of morning returning, small steps, small tasks. Everything measured and familiar, but as Emily reached for her bag, her eyes caught the card again where she had left it, resting on the table like it had not moved, like it had not been part of something that shifted the ground beneath her. She paused, just for a moment, her fingers brushing against it before she slid it into her bag without fully deciding to, the motion instinctive rather than planned, as if some part of her understood that ignoring it completely was no longer an option. Outside, the air carried a cleaner edge. The storm gone, replaced by something clearer, and Emily walked with a steadier pace than the day before, her thoughts more organized, her focus sharper, but beneath it all, there was something new, something she could not quite name, a quiet awareness that she was not moving through the city the same way anymore. Across town, Adrian stood exactly where he had been the night before, the same window, the same view, but the difference was not in the setting, it was in the absence of movement, the lack of interruption, the waiting that had not been part of his routine until now. The phone on the table behind him remained untouched, silent, and yet it held more attention than any conversation in the room, because sometimes silence carried more meaning than words. She will not call, the same voice repeated, quieter this time, as if testing whether the certainty still held, and Adrian finally turned. His expression unchanged but his focus sharper, more defined. No, he said, simple. Final, and yet he moved toward the phone anyway, not to check it, not to expect something different, but because understanding a pattern did not mean ignoring its exceptions. Back on the street, Emily stepped into the diner once more, the familiar sounds wrapping around her like a routine she could rely on, but as she moved through her shift, something felt different in the smallest ways, the way she noticed the door opening, the way she caught herself looking toward it without meaning to, the way her hand brushed lightly against her bag where the card rested, as if confirming it was still there. Time passed quickly, as it always did when there was too much to do, and by the time her shift ended, the sun had already begun to dip again, casting longer shadows across the sidewalk, and Emily stepped outside, adjusting her bag, preparing to head home, when her phone vibrated unexpectedly in her hand. A number she did not recognize lighting up the screen. She stared at it for a second. Her heart beat steady but louder again, and somewhere across the city, another phone rested silent on a table, untouched, while the man who owned it stood perfectly still, as if he already knew that something had just changed without needing to see it happen. Emily stared at the screen for a second longer than necessary. The unknown number glowing faintly against the fading daylight, and for a moment she considered letting it ring out, letting it pass like everything else she did not have time to deal with, but something in the timing felt too precise, too aligned with everything that had already happened to ignore. Her thumb hovered, then pressed accept, and she lifted the phone to her ear, her voice steady when she spoke. Hello? The line was quiet for a fraction of a second, not empty, just measured, like the person on the other end was deciding exactly how much to say and when. You kept it. Adrian's voice came through, low and unmistakable, and Emily felt the connection immediately, not surprise, not shock, just recognition settling into place as if it had been waiting for this exact moment. She glanced down at her bag instinctively, as if the card inside it might somehow respond. Before answering, I did not think. It was something to throw away, and even as she said it, she realized how different that sounded from what she had told herself earlier. On the other end, there was a pause, not hesitation, but acknowledgement, and when he spoke again, there was a slight shift in tone, something less distant, more focused. Good, he said, simple, direct, and the word carried more weight than it should have, like approval that was not given lightly. Emily shifted her weight slightly on the sidewalk, aware of people passing around her, of the world continuing as if this conversation was not happening, and yet everything felt sharper, more defined, like the edges of the moment had come into focus. Is there something you need? She asked, not out of obligation, but because the question felt necessary, something that placed structure around a situation that had none. Adrian did not answer immediately, and when he did, it was not what she expected. "Your daughter," he said, and Emily's breath caught. Just slightly before she could stop it, the smallest reaction, but enough to shift the air between them. "Her fever broke this morning," he continued, not intrusive, not threatening, just stating a fact in a way that made it clear it was not a guess, and Emily's fingers tightened around the phone, not in fear, but in the realization of how much he already knew. "She is fine," Emily replied, her voice quieter now but steady, protective in a way that did not need to be raised to be clear. There was another pause, longer this time, and when Adrian spoke again, his tone had changed in a way she could not immediately define, something closer to consideration than control. "There is a clinic 3 blocks from your apartment," he said. "They stay open late. They will see her tonight if you take her." And the statement landed differently than anything else he had said so far, not an order, not a demand. Just information offered with quiet certainty. Emily looked down the street without really seeing it, her mind processing the implication, the awareness behind the words, the way he had turned observation into something actionable without crossing the line she had drawn. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked, and this time there was no hesitation in her voice, only the need for something that made sense. On the other end, Adrian exhaled slowly, the sound barely audible, and when he answered, it was simple in a way that left no room for interpretation. "Because you did not take what was easy," he said, "and that changes things," and the line went quiet for a second longer before he added, softer now, almost as if the words were meant more for himself than for her, "for both of us." And when the call ended, Emily remained standing there for a moment, the phone still in her hand, the world around her unchanged, and yet something in it no longer felt the same. Emily did not move right away after the call ended, the phone still warm in her hand as the noise of the street slowly returned to full volume around her, cars passing, voices overlapping, the ordinary world continuing without pause, but inside her, something had shifted again, quieter this time, deeper, like a line had been crossed without her fully seeing where it began. She lowered the phone slowly, her thoughts circling not around what he said, but how he said it, the absence of pressure. The absence of expectation, and yet the presence of certainty that made it feel like a decision had already been made somewhere beyond her reach. She turned toward home without thinking, her steps faster now, more focused, the distance between the diner and her apartment shrinking with each passing second as the idea of the clinic settled into something practical, something she could act on, not because he told her to, but because it made sense in a way she could not ignore. When she reached the building, she climbed the stairs 2 at a time, her breath slightly uneven as she pushed the door open, her eyes immediately finding Lily sitting up again, a little stronger now, a little more present, and that alone was enough to steady everything else. "We are going out," Emily said gently, already reaching for Lily's jacket, her movements efficient, practiced, and Lily did not question it, trusting the tone more than the words, slipping her small arms into the sleeves as Emily adjusted them carefully. Outside, the evening air carried a sharper chill, and Emily kept one hand lightly on Lily's shoulder as they walked, the streetlights flickering on one by one, casting long reflections across the pavement, guiding them forward in a way that felt almost intentional. The clinic was exactly where he said it would be, 3 blocks away, its sign lit softly, not bright, not crowded, just present, and Emily paused for a fraction of a second before pushing the door open, as if acknowledging the choice she was making without needing to question it further. Inside, the space was clean, quiet, and unexpectedly welcoming, the kind of place that did not rush or overwhelm, and within minutes, they were being seen, not turned away, not delayed, just accepted in a way that felt unfamiliar and relieving all at once. Across the city, Adrian stood once again near the window, but this time he did not look down at the streets, his attention resting instead on the reflection in the glass, his own expression unreadable even to himself for a brief moment before it settled back into its usual calm. He did not check his phone, did not wait for confirmation, because he did not need it. The outcome already aligned with what he expected, not because he controlled it, but because he understood it. Back at the clinic, Emily sat beside Lily, listening as the doctor spoke, explaining simple things that should not have been difficult to access, offering solutions that felt within reach instead of out of it, and for the first time in days, maybe longer, the tension in her shoulders eased just slightly, enough to let her breathe. Without counting the seconds between each inhale, as they stepped back outside later, the night fully settled now, Lily leaned lightly against her side, tired but better, and Emily looked down at her for a moment before lifting her gaze toward the street ahead, her thoughts no longer scattered, no longer uncertain, but not entirely her own either. Somewhere in that quiet shift, she realized something she had not allowed herself to consider before, that this was no longer just about a wallet, or a choice, or a moment that passed, but something that had extended beyond it, something that had reached into her life without force and changed the direction of it anyway. And as she walked home, the card still in her bag, the memory of his voice still clear, she understood without fully admitting it that this was only the beginning of something she could not yet see the end of. The walk back felt different, not lighter, not easier, but steadier, like something that had been uncertain before had quietly found its place without asking permission, and Emily noticed it in the smallest ways, in the way Lily's hand rested more loosely in hers, in the way her own steps no longer rushed ahead of her thoughts, in the way the night air felt sharper but less overwhelming. When they reached the apartment, she moved through the routine again, but this time it did not feel like survival, it felt like care, intentional and present, the kind that did not come from urgency alone. Lily curled up on the couch once more, her eyes already heavy, and Emily sat beside her for a moment longer than usual, watching the slow rhythm of her breathing, the calm that had replaced the tension from the day before, and for a brief second, she allowed herself to feel something close to relief without immediately calculating what might follow. The card remained in her bag, but it no longer felt like an object she was avoiding. It felt like something waiting, not demanding, not intruding, just there, connected to a series of events that had not yet finished unfolding. Across the city, Adrian had not moved far from where he had been earlier, but the stillness around him had shifted, less about waiting now and more about observing what came next, and though no one in the room spoke, there was an understanding that something had changed in a way that did not require explanation. He did not need updates, did not ask for confirmation, because the outcome was already clear in the pattern he had recognized, not forced, not controlled, but aligned. Back in the apartment, Emily finally stood and moved toward the small table, pulling the card from her bag and placing it in front of her. The number printed on it simple, unassuming, and yet carrying more weight than anything else in the room. She sat down slowly, her fingers resting lightly against the edge of the table as her thoughts moved through everything that had led to this point, not just the wallet, not just the knock on the door, but the quiet way he had stepped into her life without breaking it, without demanding anything in return. She picked up her phone, her movements calm, deliberate, not rushed, not hesitant, and for a moment she just held it there, the silence stretching long enough to feel intentional. This was not about obligation, not about repayment, it was about acknowledgement, about choosing to respond rather than simply react, and that difference mattered more than she expected. When she finally dialed the number, the sound of the line connecting felt louder than it should have, each second carrying more weight than the last until it was answered, not immediately, but not delayed either. Just enough to confirm that the call had been expected without needing to be. Emily Carter, his voice came through again, the same calm certainty, the same recognition that did not need introduction, and for a moment she did not speak, not because she could not, but because she was adjusting to the fact that this connection now existed on both sides, not just his. The clinic helped, she said finally, her voice steady, clear, and the words felt like more than information, they felt like a bridge, something that crossed the distance between them without forcing it. There was a pause on the other end, not empty, but considered, and when Adrian responded, his tone carried something new, subtle but unmistakable. "I know," he said, and this time it was not just certainty, it was awareness, the kind that came from paying attention in ways most people did not. Emily glanced toward Lily, still asleep, still safe, and something in her expression softened just slightly before she looked forward again. "I wanted you to hear it from me," she added, and as the silence settled once more between them, it no longer felt like distance, it felt like something else entirely, something that was no longer one-sided, something that had chosen to continue. The line did not disconnect right away after she spoke, and that small detail mattered more than anything else, because silence, in that moment, was no longer empty, it was shared, intentional, carrying something that neither of them rushed to fill. Emily sat still, her eyes drifting once toward Lily before settling forward again, her grip on the phone relaxed now, not tense, not uncertain, just present in a way that felt unfamiliar but not unwelcome. On the other end, Adrian remained exactly Where he was, the city stretching behind him in quiet patterns of light, but his attention was no longer on the view, it was on the voice that had chosen to reach back instead of turning away, and that choice, simple as it seemed, shifted something in a way he had not anticipated. Most people would have taken it, he said after a moment, his tone even, reflective rather than analytical this time, as if he was not stating a fact but acknowledging a difference he could not ignore, and Emily did not respond immediately, not because she disagreed, but because the statement did not feel like something she needed to defend or explain. Most people are not me, she replied finally, the words quiet but steady, carrying no pride, no hesitation, just truth in its simplest form, and for a brief second, something almost unnoticeable passed through Adrian's expression, not surprise, not amusement, but recognition of something rare, something that did not fit into the categories he was used to sorting people into. The city outside moved as it always did, distant and constant, but inside that conversation, time had slowed just enough to make every word land differently, heavier, more defined, and when Adrian spoke again, his voice carried a new layer beneath it, something closer to intention than observation. That is exactly why this does not end here, he said, not as a warning, not as a promise, but as a conclusion that had already taken shape. Emily's fingers stilled slightly against the phone, her gaze lowering for a moment as she processed the weight behind those words, not fear, not resistance, but awareness that whatever this was, it was no longer temporary, no longer something that would fade if she ignored it. I did not ask for anything, she said, and this time her voice carried a quiet boundary, not defensive, not closed, just clear in a way that did not need to be reinforced. Adrian did not interrupt, did not challenge it, because he understood the difference between refusal and independence, and when he responded, it was measured, deliberate. I know, he said, the same certainty as before, but this time it carried something else with it, something quieter, and that is why it matters, and the distinction settled between them without conflict, without pressure, just understanding that did not require agreement. Emily leaned back slightly, her shoulders easing just enough to release the last of the tension she had been holding. Her eyes drifting once more toward Lily, still asleep, still safe, and for a moment everything else felt secondary to that simple fact. Then let it matter for what it was, she said softly, her voice not dismissive, not distant, but grounded in something she could hold on to, something that belonged to her. On the other end, Adrian listened without interruption, and though he did not immediately respond, the silence that followed was not resistance, it was consideration. The kind that came from someone who was not used to being told where a line existed but recognized it when it was placed. When he finally spoke, his tone had shifted again, subtle but unmistakable, less about control, more about presence. It already does, he said, and for the first time, there was no continuation after that, no extension of the moment, just a quiet end that did not feel like a conclusion. When the call disconnected, Emily lowered the phone slowly, her reflection faint in the darkened screen. And for a moment she simply sat there, listening to the quiet of her apartment, the steady rhythm of Lily's breathing, the distant sounds of the city beyond the window, and in that stillness, she understood something she had not fully allowed herself to before, that this was not something that had been imposed on her, not entirely, it was something that had found her because of who she chose to be, and whether she wanted it or not, that choice had changed the direction of everything that came after. The night settled fully over the city, but for Emily, it did not feel as heavy as it once had, not because her life had suddenly become easier, but because something inside it had shifted in a way she could not ignore anymore. She moved quietly through the apartment, turning off the last light in the kitchen before pausing near the couch, her eyes resting on Lily for a moment longer than necessary, as if anchoring herself in what remained unchanged, what still belonged entirely to her. The small rise and fall of Lily's breathing filled the silence, steady and certain, and Emily let out a slow breath, the kind that carried both relief and something else, something she was only beginning to understand. The card still sat on the table, simple, unchanged, but no longer unfamiliar, and she reached for it without hesitation this time, her fingers tracing the edge lightly before setting it back down, not hiding it, not clinging to it, just allowing it to exist in the space she had already made for it. Outside, the city lights reflected faintly against the window, distant and constant, a reminder that there were worlds beyond hers that moved with different rules, different expectations, and yet somehow, those worlds had crossed without breaking anything in their path. Across that distance, Adrian stood once more in the quiet of his own space, but this time, the stillness around him was not about observation. It was about decision, not forced, not rushed, just clear in a way that did not require repetition. He had seen enough, understood enough, and more importantly, recognized something that did not fit into the patterns he had spent years mastering, something that did not bend, did not ask, did not calculate, and that difference did not push him away, it held him there. Back in the apartment, Emily finally sat down, her hands resting loosely in her lap. Her thoughts no longer scattered, no longer searching for explanations that did not exist, because she understood now that this was not something that needed to be solved, it was something that had already begun, something that had found its place without permission. She looked toward the window, her reflection faint in the glass, and for a moment, she saw not just who she had been before, but who she had chosen to be in a moment that could have gone differently, a moment that had quietly changed everything that followed. Somewhere in that understanding, a new clarity settled in, not about him, not about what he represented, but about herself, about the fact that nothing he brought into her life would matter if it did not align with what she already stood for, and that truth did not weaken under pressure, it held. Across the city, Adrian turned slightly from the window, his gaze no longer searching, no longer waiting, but fixed on something that had already taken shape, and though no words were spoken, the decision was there, quiet and absolute, not about possession, not about control, but about presence, about the simple fact that some things, once recognized, were not meant to be ignored. Back in the quiet apartment, Emily leaned back slowly, her eyes closing for a brief moment, not out of exhaustion, but out of acceptance, and as the silence settled around her once more, it no longer felt empty, it felt full of something unspoken, something that had not asked to be part of her life but had become part of it anyway. And in that stillness, one thought remained, clear and steady, not loud, not dramatic, just true in the way that mattered most, that sometimes, the world did not change because someone powerful decided it should, sometimes, it changed because someone ordinary refused to become anything less than who they already were.